Peace family, today is January 21st, 2020, and you're listening to From the Streets to the Statehouse podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a grassroots think tank located here in Baltimore, Maryland, and we are unapologetically black in our advocacy for legislation that affects our communities. One way you can support this podcast and support our work in Baltimore is by becoming a sustainer, which is a person who donates monthly to the work that we do here in Baltimore. If you'd like to do that, go to www.lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. So again, my name is Adam Jackson, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. For our first-time listeners, we decided to start doing this podcast from the streets to the Statehouse because we thought it was essential for our community to know what's happening in Annapolis during the Maryland General Assembly. If you're unfamiliar with the Maryland General Assembly, that is the time of year between January and April for 90 days where our legislators meet in Annapolis to pass all laws that relate to things ranging from criminal justice to education to economics, economic policy, and so forth. And so we think that it's important that we are educated not just about the statewide issues that impact us, but also specifically here in Baltimore, and also for us to know what's happening in terms of the political landscape. And so we were looking for places to find that, both in podcast form and in media, and we found that there weren't really many podcasts that had that analysis from a community-centered perspective. And so that's why we're here today. We're From the Streets to the Statehouse. So Dayvon Love is our Director of Public Policy here at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And what he's going to be doing each episode is giving you an in-depth analysis of not just what we're working on in Annapolis, but also just going deeper on the issues that matter the most to you. And so on this first episode, he's going to be talking a lot about what's been happening at the beginning of session, which has already been in session for about, I think, a week and a half. And so Dayvon's going to be giving some analysis about what's happening in general, and also just go deeper on some of the issues that are affecting us around Maryland statewide. And so we hope you enjoy, and thank you for listening.
This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is our podcast, Streets to the Statehouse. And really the purpose of this, normally we send out legislative updates where we kind of send out a kind of written record of some of the work that we're doing in Annapolis to update our base, about some of the work that we're doing. We decided to do this podcast is because we want to provide an opportunity for our base and our supporters to hear more in detail about some of the advocacy that we're doing and some of the general dynamics. And being that we're an independent black organization, we're unapologetic about our challenging of the system of white supremacy and racism, and about the importance of black self-determination. We provide a unique perspective, both in terms of how we navigate the legislative process and just our approach to politics. And so really the purpose of this is to provide more extensive commentary and more nuanced explanation of our policy priorities for those that are interested in those details. And so what I'll do over the course of our time together is at first I'll give just general commentary about the climate, the general political climate in Annapolis. There have been some pretty significant changes over the past year, and so I'll detail some commentary about that. And then I'll talk more specifically about some of our legislative priorities and some of the things that we're working on. And then I'll end out with just some general things that you all as supporters can do to help advance our legislative agenda. So first, just want to start with some of the major changes. And one of the things that's important to know about Baltimore is that many of the policies that impact Baltimore are providence of state and local law. So for instance, LBS has been involved heavily in criminal justice reform in Baltimore, but the law that governs criminal justice is the providence of state law. And so what has happened over the past years are pretty significant changes. They're in our legislature, we have a bicameral legislature. We have a House of Delegates and a state Senate. And so recently we have a new Speaker of the House and a new Senate President. Before last session, we had the late Michael E. Bush and Senate President Mike Miller. Bush had at the time had been Speaker since 2003, and Mike Miller had been Senate President since 1987. And so So in the 2020 session, we have a new Speaker of the House of Delegates, Speaker Adrian Jones, and we also have a new Senate President, Bill Ferguson. Speaker Jones represents a district in Baltimore County, and Bill Ferguson represents Baltimore City. And they're both believed to be more progressive, better on social justice issues than their predecessors. So I want to talk a little bit about their predecessors, Mike Bush and Mike Miller, and talk about just what them being presiding officers meant for the general political climate in Annapolis. Many people would probably, and LBS takes the position, that the previous regime of presiding officers represented more of the centrist corporate wing of the Democratic Party. I'm sure if you look at national politics and you look at just the direction the Democratic Party is going, you're seeing a growing rift between those that are in the more center of the party versus those who are more in the so-called progressive wing of the party. And so those dynamics have impacted Maryland. Well, in the previous regime of presiding officers, it was pretty much understood that very radical approaches to racial justice are typically things that people just have very low expectations of. Our experience, for instance, on police reform, when the uprising happened, we were actually advocating on amendments to the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, a law that was codified in 1974 that gives police officers rights above and beyond their constitutional rights. And one of the things that we were pushing for were civilians, non-police officers on police trial boards, with the idea of having the community more involved in the disciplinary process of law enforcement. Well, during the 2015 session, which began in January of 2015, we couldn't even get that bill out of committee. Uprising happens in April of 2015, and in May of 2015, both presiding officers, they pulled together a task force to look at policing and addressing the issue of police reform. What's interesting is that, the thing that we were fighting for was about really shifting the power differential, right? Making it so the community actually had power to be involved in the disciplining of law enforcement officers. But what ended up happening is that when the actual leadership bill came down, the bill that both presiding officers sponsored as a result of the task force they created, it had things like increased training, things about body cameras, but it didn't address the ability for the community to exert power over law enforcement. And that's really, when you think about, the Democratic Party establishment, you think about the limitation of liberals. A big part of the limitation is that liberals in the Democratic Party establishment tend to want to put forward legislative efforts that give the appearance of racial justice without shifting the power dynamics, without shifting the power differential that is really the most substantive way to address issues of injustice. And so that was an example where they put out a bill that didn't include civilians on trial boards. It didn't include greater levels of transparency so that the community could be aware of how the police department was actually operating. And so that was that's an example of what I think is what was pretty typical of the previous regime of presiding office and giving the greatest appearance of racial justice without shifting the power differential. And so many groups that have been advocating for issues that relate to racial justice would run into this roadblock, particularly with Mike Miller. Mike Miller, for many folks, was a kind of a particularly problematic figure on many of these issues. So I'm good. And so what has happened is that now we have pretty significant change, where Speaker Adrian Jones, who's the first black person and first woman to be a presiding officer in the Maryland legislature, and Bill Ferguson, who's significantly younger than Mike Miller, and also who many people understand to be more progressive than Mike Miller. And so these are changes that I think many people felt that there would be greater levels of successful efforts on racial justice advocacy in Annapolis. And so, what I want to do is I want to talk about a concept that I think is really important in helping to put some of these changes in its proper context, and it's the notion of incorporated resistance. So, a part of what happens is that when changes happen, where power is trying to maintain itself, but that there's a groundswell that wants to push policy in a much more progressive stance. Oftentimes what happens is that institutions of power will do what's necessary in supporting individuals and programs that espouse very radical and direct rhetoric about issues of race. But what often happens is that though that rhetoric is often used as a mechanism, again, to give the appearance of justice, but maintaining the status quo. And so one of the things that LBS is going to be looking for during this General Assembly, given the new leadership, is the extent to which this incorporated resistance will be at play. To what extent will the appearance of a more progressive Senate president and a new Speaker of the House of Delegates, how much of that is a signal of actual change, or how much of the change is actually an attempt at the strategy of incorporated resistance? And I'm going to give an example of what I've already seen during this year's General Assembly that actually point in the direction of this notion of incorporated resistance. So one of the committees that LBS has had to engage pretty often are both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. Previously, the chair of the Senate the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee was the former Senator Bobby Zirkin, of the 11th District in the kind of Pikesville, Owings Mills area. Bobby Zirkin was an opponent of many of the efforts of LBS to advance racial justice. Bobby Zirkin was a big supporter of the bail bonds industry that we fought very strongly against during the 2017 General Assembly. In 2018, he convened, and in his capacity as chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, a big forum to talk about crime in Baltimore, which ended up in the development of a crime bill package that he pushed forward and that he was very insistent about. And in fact, we have a pretty well documented and recorded back and forth where him and I are actually talking about the limitations of mandatory minimums and addressing issues of homicide and violence. And so Senator Zirkin, he resigned last month. And so we have a new chair of Judicial Proceedings Committee, Senator Will Smith out of Montgomery County. Now, Will Smith has a better voting record on many of our issues than Senator Zirkin did. For instance, on bail, Senator Smith actually voted with us and against the bail industry. And so Will Smith kind of signals a change in many people's minds, new possibilities in terms of the kinds of criminal justice reform that'll be possible. And so one of the things that happened this past week in Annapolis was that Senator Smith convened a briefing. So one of the things that happens in Annapolis is that different committees will have briefings where different groups will come before them and basically give them general information about issues that are likely to come before their committee. And so Senator Smith had the foresight of convening a briefing on racial and gender disparities for his committee, because a lot of the conversations that we had and that we've been having in the committee are conversations that are a big part of, that are a big part of the kind of conversations that are had in that committee. It's one of the things that we bring up. And so he had a briefing. Now, one of the things that happened during this briefing is that there were a bunch of organizations that actually, came and provided, in many cases, really good information about some of the disparities. And so you had, organizations like the ACLU, organizations like the Justice Policy Institute, Maryland Department of Corrections. And so you had a variety of different organizations that came in and did the briefing. One of the things that, we were really, myself and some of my colleagues were disappointed with is the fact that in this briefing on racial and gender disparities, that you didn't have really any, Black-led organizations who specialize specifically on issues that face Black people as one of the folks that were on the briefing panel. And so this is one of those ways in which incorporated resistance operates, where you have white-led organizations that are essentially in a position where they're leading the charge on issues of racial justice in ways in which Black organizations get marginalized. And I just want to make a quick note that while, like, the ACLU of Maryland is, its executive director is a Black woman, when you think about historically the ACLU and its national office, it's not generally understood to be an organization that is Black-led and that specializes on issues facing Black people. So when I talk about, the kinds of organizations that would make sense, I offered LBS as an organization that should be on the briefing panel. And there are other organizations that should have been on the briefing panel. Black-led organizations that directly address issues of racism and white supremacy that could have really helped the committee have a better understanding of some of the dynamics that they're going to be faced with in evaluating legislation that's going to come before them. And so that's just one small example. Now we're going to have a conversation with Senator Smith, and the hope is to provide a forum for the committee to really engage some of these issues more substantively and engage them from organizations that, again, have a specific charge and working directly with Black people and have a strong, rigorous expertise in racism and white supremacy, from a different lens than those that presented at the briefing panel. So we're gonna work with Senator Smith and hope to make sure that we put in place a way for his committee to really hear some of the complex and nuanced perspectives on racial justice that wasn't really made available in the briefing that was had. One of the other things that I want to talk about quickly before I jump into some of the specific legislative items is that one of the things that is of a huge conversation in Annapolis this year, as it has been over the past several years, is the question of public safety. So the issue of violence in Baltimore is something that legislators all around the state are talking about. And unfortunately, the way that Baltimore is talked about in the legislature carries with it many of the kind of racist caricatures that are a part of the collective American consciousness. LBS pretty soon is actually going to produce a written piece that'll actually comprehensively look at the ways in which white supremacy impacts much of the discourse on public safety. But what I want to say here is that many of the legislators who are, lawmakers in Annapolis, many of them have concerns about Baltimore and the violence that's happening in Baltimore. But many of those concerns are being expressed in ways where many of the solutions to the problem that have been disproven over many years are being suggested. And so from the governor, you're hearing things about sentence enhancements. You're hearing people talk about, and just the way that people are talking about Baltimore, just as a huge problem. Crime in Baltimore is getting out of hand, without much understanding of many of the issues that contribute to the violence that exists in Baltimore. And unfortunately, many of the people who are engaged in making legislation that impacts Baltimore have not interacted in substantive ways with the community. And so you have people making policies really out of fear, really out of caricatures that they get from corporate media, and not from a real engagement with the community and the things that people are doing to address violence, figuring out ways to really be helpful to the folks that are on the ground. And so look forward to the document that I mentioned that LBS will put out that talks more specifically about public safety and the nature of the discourse that's happening about that. Because that's going to impact some of the things that are in our legislative agenda. All right, so some of the things that we're working on in Annapolis. So if you received our legislative agenda, and we want to thank the Afro-American for actually publishing our legislative agenda. That was really helpful in pushing out some of the things that we're working on. I'm going to talk about two of the things that are on the legislative agenda because there's some movement around and there's some relevant things happening. And then I'm going to talk about another legislative effort that we've actually been kind of recruited to be a part of that relates to some of our larger legislative package. So one of the big things we're working on, police reform is something that we've worked on for many years. And so this year is another year that we're going to be working on police reform. And we're partnering with the ACLU and pushing forward changes to the Maryland Public Information Act. So one of the things that's important to note is that investigatory and personnel records of law enforcement are prohibited from being released to the public. And so if you're an independent organization or any agency external to the police department and you make a Freedom of Information request, a Freedom of Information Act request to the department on investigatory or personnel records of law enforcement officers, that is prohibited. And that's important because if we're serious about accountability, if we're serious about the community having the ability to hold law enforcement accountable, but we need access to the kind of information so that we know some of the patterns of behavior of law enforcement so that we can properly hold the police department accountable. And so historically what law enforcement has done, kind of using a labor approach to this conversation about their personnel records, saying that, individual officers as workers are entitled to not having their personnel records subject to public scrutiny. But what we believe is that if you're a law enforcement officer, you're essentially sanctioned by the state to use force that potentially is deadly force. And so given just the issue of police brutality, that is a systemic issue in our community, it's important for us to have a level of oversight over law enforcement so that we can really address the ways in which police impact our community. And so we're working, us and LBS and the ACLU are working together to pass changes to the Maryland Public Information Act that would allow these investigatory and personnel records to be made available to the public. And so last year, this was actually something we worked on last year, and we weren't able to reach an agreement with the Police and Sheriff's Association of Maryland. One of the concessions that they were actually willing to give us last session was that they would be willing to release those records in incidents where someone from the public was either killed or experienced severe bodily harm. We rejected that compromise because for us, it was important to have a more expansive list of the kinds of activities that officers were engaged in that we could pursue their personnel records. Just getting the records of those officers that were engaged in severe bodily harm or killing somebody is a small universe of the kinds of things that are important for us to really know what's happening within the police department. It will only give us some of, some of the most egregious cases, but doesn't really give us a full picture for us to have enough information to really hold law enforcement accountable. And one of the things I want to add to that, particularly when you think about, as Black people, one of the things that tends to happen is that Black people, public safety is a public good. Like, we have a right and responsibility to control the institutions that govern our lives. And so the idea that our community should have information about the institution that serves us, is really a fundamental human right. It's only in a society structured on racism and white supremacy that there could be severe pushback to the idea that those that law enforcement serves shouldn't have the right to have oversight over the activities and behaviors of those that are serving us. So that's a really big part of why, for LBS, it was important for us to work on this Maryland Public Information Act. Now I mentioned, there was a compromise that we were offered last session that we rejected. At the start of this session, there's actually already been a whole lot of work done, excuse me, on the Maryland Public Information Act. And so we've actually already had a subcommittee meeting where myself and Tony Honus from the ACLU got a chance to talk to a subcommittee within the House Judiciary Committee with the committee chair, vice chair, and some of the members of the committee, and the police and sheriffs, and the FOP was present at the subcommittee meeting. And the police chiefs and sheriffs are actually, have been way more cooperative and actually push way further than we were last session. And so they actually have their own bill draft of this change to the Maryland Public Information Act. And part of their stated rationale is that the Police and Chiefs Association is a collection of police chiefs and sheriffs. And so what they argue is that they want the ability to tell the public about bad officers, given some of the constraints from the collective bargaining contract and some of the protections that law enforcement officers get. Police chiefs find it difficult to do the work of ridding the department of police officers that are problematic. So their stated objective is to give themselves more tools and more cover to be able to get rid of police officers that are problematic. And so they've been, much more willing this session, particularly in the beginning of the session, to put forward something that goes well beyond what the compromise that was proposed last session. And so that's progress. One of the things that we want to make sure is very clear is that our purpose for wanting the Maryland Public Information Act change and making it so that these personnel records and investigatory records are available to the public is not solely to give police chiefs tools for them to be able to discipline officers and provide cover for them to discipline officers. We want it so that the community has access to that information to hold both law enforcement and police leadership, police chiefs and sheriffs accountable as well for the decisions they are or are not making in terms of the kinds of discipline that are being dispensed to police officers. And so one of the things that we're in the midst of trying to find an agreement about and we're negotiating currently is around this category of sustained and unsustained complaints. So essentially what that means is that there was some reluctance on the part of the police chiefs and sheriffs to provide investigatory records to investigations that were unsustained, and there were a couple of other categories that actually the FOP representative kind of laid out, where there was sustained, which means you did it, unsustained, which means they couldn't prove one way or the other, unfounded, which means there was really no basis, it never happened, exonerated, they didn't do it. And so there are a bunch of other categories that they describe. We're interested in investigations and files that come from just a variety of these different categories. We don't just want the ones that were sustained, the ones that the police chiefs, the ones that the investigation that they did internally said that they actually did. We want the whole gamut, but we don't want everything. There's some things that one of the things we said to the police chiefs and sheriffs is that we don't want records about whether they had the right uniform, or, information that releases their personal medical information. We're engaged in really honest, negotiation about the kinds of information that's pertinent. And so those negotiations are ongoing. And we look forward to being able to reach a compromise that both sides can live with, where we're able to get these investigatory records. And so we'll find out more information over the next couple of weeks about that negotiation. So that's the Maryland Public Information Act. The other part of our legislative agenda that I'll talk a little bit about is that we're going to put a bill that requires all education professionals, in order to get their certification, to have race equity or cultural responsive pedagogy training. The reason why we put this bill in is because one of the things that has happened over the past several years is that there's been much more conversation about racial equity, and it's actually one of our fears is that this notion of race equity will be absorbed into the mainstream in ways that actually take away the importance of, what race equity could really be when it's done substantively. And so one of the things that we're observing is that when you look at many of the tools that educators are using to construct curriculum and programs for young people, you have a lot of folks that don't have much orientation around the ways in which racism and white supremacy impacts the kinds of methodology that should be used in educating youth. And so we put this bill in and actually, for folks who aren't familiar, there's a major effort underway. The current commission that has finished its work, and it's in the process of putting forward its final report. The current commission was convened a few years ago to develop comprehensive recommendations for reforming the education system in the state of Maryland. And so there was actually a partial report that came out last year that had a set of recommendations. And in fact, in the recommendations, it talked about requiring, basically what our bill does, it talked about requiring cultural responsive pedagogy and race equity as a part of how teachers and education professionals are certified. That didn't show up in the actual legislation that the recommendations were the basis for developing. So this bill is really going back and instituting something that was in the original recommendations in the first place. And so we imagine, this question of racial equity, there is some anxiety in some quarters around this notion of race equity and cultural responsive pedagogy. Because you have a lot of human service professionals that are trained in traditional methodologies that currently being proven to be ineffective. And so really the point of cultural responsive pedagogy and race equity is to provide the kind of professional socialization that'll actually improve the quality of service of these professionals as they interact and teach and train our young people. And so again, that bill will just require that for education professionals to be certified. So that's the kind of second part of our legislative agenda. One of the other things that we're working on, we've actually, we partnered with Bridge Maryland, which is a statewide faith-based organization that does community organizing. A good friend of mine and colleague, Reverend Brian Murray, who is in leadership of that organization, him and I have been talking over the past several years and talking about being more supportive of each other. And so one of the efforts that they're really interested in pushing forward is this idea that youth should that there should be a requirement that when youth are interrogated by police officers, that their parents are immediately notified and that legal representation is present. So if you've seen the Netflix docuseries, When They See Us, this is what Reverend Murray and Reverend Marlon Tillman, this is what they talk about. The inspiration for this idea is wanting to make sure that youth have legal representation and that their parents are notified immediately when they're detained. And so the idea is for them to have legal representation so that youth are not, in a legally compromised position when they're being confronted with law enforcement. And when we think about, again, some of the racist caricatures that are often projected onto Black people and particularly Black youth, and we think about some of the poor treatment that many of our youth get from law enforcement, among others, the purpose of this bill is to really provide a safeguard so that there's legal representation present so that the police officers aren't abusing the rights of those young people. So that's another effort that we're going to be supportive of. And Bridge Maryland is actually going to have an event in Harford County on January 25th, where they've invited LBS to come and speak and be a part of them, essentially galvanizing the community and educating them about this particular issue. And again, it's important because as I talked about a moment ago, when you think about the system of racism and white supremacy and how our youth are represented as inherently violent, oftentimes what happens is that the rights of young people are violated because people don't really respect the humanity of many of our young black people. And so it's important. So this is a really important effort that Bridge Maryland is interested in endeavoring and pursuing, and LBS is going to partner with them in doing that. So that's really much of the updates in terms of our legislative work. What you all can do to support the work that we're doing, because, I went through a lot of detail, and really the importance of that is just to show just the level of work and the level of detail it takes to really navigate and do advocacy in the legislative space. And so hopefully for those of you that are just really interested in a lot of the intricate details, that this was helpful in really going through some of the work that we're doing and some of the dynamics that are at play in doing some of this legislative advocacy. And as I mentioned at the top, many of the changes that have happened in the Maryland General Assembly at the leadership level, it's going to be interesting to us to see how more difficult or easier it'll be to push forward the things that are on this agenda. So some of the things that you can do to help. One of the things that we tell people is one of the most important things in being helpful to us is signing up for our listserv. And when we put out action alerts, so periodically we're going to put out action alerts where we essentially tell you about a particular legislative issue and we ask you to call or contact your legislator. So there may be a piece of legislation that's going to be up for a vote, and we may put out an action alert to ask you all to call a particular committee, maybe a particular committee chair, maybe urge the Baltimore City delegation, maybe urge the Black Caucus. We'll put out action alerts to ask you all to contact your legislators or legislators that are on the bodies that we're targeting, and essentially ask you all to reach out to your legislators. And that actually helps tremendously. The work that we do in Annapolis is made possible by the fact that you all, when we ask you to send these emails or call your legislators, and so we continue to ask you all that when we put out our action alerts that you all are responsive. Again, it helps tremendously. The other thing you all can do is share this podcast. And so it's going to be really important for people to really hear directly from us, just our legislative agenda and our perspective. The General Assembly is 90 days. It's a lot of stuff crammed into a very small amount of time. And so a lot of times, as hard as you may try, you don't have enough time to get to every single person. And so really the importance of this podcast is really to provide information that anyone can go to at their leisure to be able to hear the perspective of LBS, to hear the legislation that we're working on, and for people to have the information they need to support our work. So that's our first From the Streets to the Statehouse podcast. Again, looking forward to your engagement, looking forward to your support, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks to give you updates on where we are next. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and thank you for listening. Thank you always for your support. Peace.
Thank you for listening to From the Streets to the Statehouse. I'm Adam Jackson, Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You've been listening to Dayvon Love, the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This podcast was produced and edited by Theo Atlas, and you can listen to From the Streets to the Statehouse on all major streaming platforms for podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you want to support Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. See you next time.